Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Theresa May is in the midst of a crisis. While she survived a no-confidence vote in Parliament, her delay of a vote on her Brexit deal has not paid off. The EU is playing hardball and has not budged, especially on the border issue between Ireland and Northern Ireland. To discuss that and other related issues, we're joined now by Mr. Richard Connor, who is a journalist, and he's with DW English, and he's joining us live now from Germany. Good morning, Richard. Thank you for joining us here in the Scope. Richard, what do you make of this week as it's been for Theresa May? Firstly, she wins that no-confidence vote, but then the EU is still playing hardball.
Hi, good morning. I think it was a little bit of a disaster that she had to face the no confidence vote anyway. I think that she was trying to gain concessions, although they were concessions she was never going to get. Really, she was never going to get anything very substantial. I think everybody knew that. I don't think Theresa May really knows what she wants at the moment. She's just being forced to go back to Europe by her own party, and she really just has to look as though she's pushing for some kind of concessions, but nobody really knows what it is that she wants, because the British government has already agreed to a guarantee on Northern Ireland on the border, and so the fear is among a lot of Tories on the very hard Brexit side. The fear is that we will be in a customs union forever and we'll have no exit. And I understand that, but it's just an insoluble problem at the moment, it seems.
Indeed. Do you think that she has aligned herself, Richard, with the wrong parties? Because we have the DUP, obviously, and that's adding on ever more pressure on her to stand by her version of Brexit deal. Others, of course, such as Labour, I imagine, would argue for a softer Brexit. What do you make?
Yeah, I think most people in Labour would argue for softer Brexit. There are some very sort of Eurosceptic Labour people. I mean, originally Labour was the party that was against joining the European Union back in the 60s, early 70s. But I think Theresa May she had no choice really after she went for a new election last year. She had no choice but the DUP. It was the only party that would align itself with the Conservatives. It's a unionist party, the Democratic Unionist Party, and the Conservative Party's name is obviously the Conservative and Unionist Party, the full name. So they're natural allies, but it's kind of incredible that they ended up together, that they ended up in this situation where, her government basically relies on the DUP, and this question came up now. It's just one of those incredible things that history throws up.
Indeed. Let me add another voice to this conversation. We're joined now by Mr. Ali Sadr Naqvi, who is a former ambassador, and he's joining us live from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. And Mr. Naqvi, thank you for joining us here in the Scope. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Naqvi, what you make of the current Brexit crisis, what this means not just for the UK, but for Europe as a whole.
The Brexit crisis is a very serious matter for Europe and for the UK itself, because the decision to withdraw from the European Union was a decision based on some wrong presumptions that European Union was impoverishing the UK, that the agreements that the UK had with them were disadvantageous and all that, which were not valid in terms of the reality. So that Brexit referendum, I cast the die against the UK, and now they are trying to salvage the situation. Theresa May is doing a lot, but there are two sticking points. One is on the Irish border issue, and the other is the fishing right and apportionment of fishing industry and its future. So these are the two basic issues that are causing the problem.
Right.
But the broader framework is even more complicated, and under that framework, they are not able to reach any satisfactory solution, except for the deal that Theresa May finally managed to salvage out of the European Union. And that is highly controversial in the UK itself. So there is a danger that there may be no deal. And that, I think, would be very harmful to British economy. So, that is the broad picture that
Right.
I understand from the developments that are taking place.
Right. If I could, Mr. Naqvi, I wanted to put two of the points that you just made to Richard, our other guest. Richard, I wanted to ask whether you think that this entire Brexit referendum, when it did happen, that there was a lot of misinformation when it came to that entire campaign, especially on the Leave side, A, and B, what do you make of any situation where there is no deal on Brexit? Many people saying that would hurt Europe just as much as it would hurt the UK.
On misinformation, I think there was a lot of misinformation on the Leave side. Possibly some. There was some on the Remain side, possibly as well. Although that was really fear of predictions that have not yet come true, because we've not yet left the EU, and there was a big issue about Project Fear on the Remain side. A lot of people that wanted Brexit, they accused politicians, etc., of Project Fear about what could happen. The fact is, we've not left yet. We might see those things happen. On the Leave side, there was a lot of misinformation. Yes, it was incredible, but we didn't really know at the time how effective that would be, and it got across the line. It got the Brexit vote across the line, but there are accusations on both sides, basically.
And what do you make of a scenario in which, when we come around to March 2019, that there is no deal in place vis-a-vis Brexit, Richard?
I really don't think that will happen. Although, well, these days, it's a bad time to make predictions because, well, we've seen things that have happened in elections and scenarios across the world, but. It would be a disaster. It would be a disaster, frankly, for Britain and for Europe, for both. I don't think that would happen because I think the majority of people in Parliament, the majority of lawmakers, would really avoid that at all costs, even to the point of maybe a second vote, a second referendum.
All right, so Mr. Naqvi, I wanted to ask you then, Tony Blair, as you may have heard, Mr. Naqvi, has said that there should be a second referendum possibly on Brexit, and now that seemingly all of the UK understands what Brexit meant to begin with. As a former ambassador yourself, do you think that, as a diplomat yourself, do you think that's a good way to go about solving the situation?
Well, it would depend upon the constitutional implications and how that will work out. And secondly, I don't know if this will change the position in regard to the Leavers and the Remainers, because both sides have ramped up their propaganda, or let's say the campaign to win over people to their sides. Now, as democracies work, the ordinary citizen doesn't sit down with all the details of a particular proposal or idea. He goes by what is the general conventional wisdom and the general perception. So this is going into untrodden territory, A, for the constitutional reasons, and B, whether the outcome will be clear. and then they start all over again. So it is a very messy situation. There is no clear resolution of the problem. And as the previous speaker on the panel said, that this would be disastrous both for the UK and as well as for the European Union. I mean, the European Union has taken more than a generation to evolve. And when I served in Brussels many years ago in the 80s, it was still the European Community. Then it became the European Union. It is almost a supranational entity, which has been built brick by brick from the old coal and steel community. So, to abandon all that on the part of the UK, which joined late but still is a member and the second largest economy in the European Union, and to set off on their own, it would be something very, very unclear, uncharted waters.
Richard, I'm wondering if you can give us a point of view from Germany then, Richard, on Tony Blair's proposal there for a second referendum. Do you think Europe would want a second referendum to be put in place? Because we have had that EU court recently saying that the UK can choose to rescind Article 50 and to possibly even remain within the EU. That opens the door, doesn't it, then, for a second referendum, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I think that court ruling is huge to some extent. I think with Tony Blair, really probably that his intervention is not, for the point of view of Remainers, is probably not so welcome because the exact people that he would want to convince, or that Remainers would want to convince to remain within the European Union are the people that the whole thing was a reaction against the politics, really, that Tony Blair created. This very centrist kind of politics. So I think, I think his intervention from all sides is kind of unwelcome. Because I think, given the war in Iraq and things, he's just lost so much credibility that people don't really want to listen. Whether that's fair or not, I don't know, but that's just the overwhelming impression that I get.
So what is the impression, Richard, if I may stay with you, in Germany itself about this entire situation? When you talk to Germans around you, what are they saying about this Brexit situation at this point?
They don't understand it. I mean, they don't understand why we would do this. It seems to them a massive act of national self-harm, I think. A lot of Germans are very sceptical, well, a large number anyway, are sceptical of the European Union and, the euro currency as well. But I think most think that it's a good thing, overwhelmingly an instrument for the good. And so they just feel, I think, that it's a huge overreaction, basically.
Just before letting you go, Mr. Naqvi, I wanted to ask you one final question. If I do know that you have to go and you have a busy schedule. But Mr. Naqvi, I wanted to ask you then, what are the ramifications of all of this on the global community, do you think? Because the UK economy certainly is an important player globally. The UK is an important player in many other areas. What is the ramification of all of this uncertainty at this point in time, in your point of view?
Well, it will add to the greater confusion that has already set in, with question marks about the WTO, with protectionist policies being followed by the United States, and in tow with that some other countries, and it would then mean a weakened European Union, and the economic ramifications would be negative. Now, how negative, that will have to be seen. As far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan has a good trade relationship with the UK, and that, I think, would not be very much affected. But Pakistan is also in cooperation with the European Union, and the European Union constitutes perhaps the second or the third biggest trading partner of Pakistan. So I think it should be not that serious for Pakistan, but not very, very positive either.
Very well, Mr. Naqvi, we'll leave it there at that with you. We're just going to go into a short break. Viewers, sure, do stay with us. We want to continue the conversation with you. Viewers, we'll be right back with more on this entire Brexit crisis as it currently stands. Viewers, thank you very much for staying with us for this segment as we're discussing Brexit and the entire political crisis that surrounds a possible no deal vis-a-vis the UK leaving the European Union, that possibility of a no deal at the least. In this segment, we're joined by Richard Connor, who's still staying with us. He's a journalist, and he's a journalist at DW English, I should say, who is joining us from Germany. And we're also now joined with Mr. Ashraf Jahangir Ghazi, who is a former ambassador, and he's joining us live now from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. Gentlemen, thank you both for staying with us. Mr. Ghazi, I'd like to start with you, if I may, in this segment. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts at this point in time about the uncertainty that exists regarding how Britain may leave the EU.
Yes, this is a very complicated, interesting, and conceivably dangerous development. I'm not an expert, but what I gather from following the news is that they've reached a very critical stage right now. But to go back a little, I believe the UK was never very comfortable with being part or politically a part of Europe. As you may well recall, General de Gaulle had rejected the application of the UK to join what was then the common market, before it became the EU, if I'm not mistaken. And then later on, it was Prime Minister Edward Heath who brought the UK into, the common market, European Union, which is essentially a conservative economic club. But the UK always looked more towards the US than it did towards Europe. There were all kinds of sayings about, how the English felt towards Europe. The humorous quote, I don't know if it was for real or not, that on a foggy afternoon, the British tabloids all talking about fog in the Channel, Europe cut off. In other words, Britain was so much more the center of the Western world than was Europe. And there were reasons for that, historical reasons. But to come to the present situation, there was a lot of alienation developing, not just in England, but around the world, with the way the economies or the liberal economies were working. A lot of alienation had developed amongst those who felt they hadn't participated in economic growth and were being left behind. And finally, to overcome this, Prime Minister David Cameron called a referendum on the assumption that he would win this, and at least put this particular debate to rest for some time, at least, and all. Well, he lost that referendum, and he then resigned. But it was very interesting. The UK is made up of England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, and there were differences amongst them. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was England and Wales that voted for, to leave, but Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to stay. So that brought in a huge complication. And then within England, the City of London and the London City itself was in favor of staying. Now then the question arose about on what terms would England leave, and of course they wanted to maintain as good a relationship and as close cooperation politically, security, and otherwise in a dangerous world. But England was adamant that it didn't want to be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and that it was not ready to accept the free movement of labor, especially from, East
Right.
Europeans who were looking for jobs in England, because that was causing
If I may come in, Mr. Qazi, I do apologize for interrupting,
Yeah.
but I wanted to put some of the points that you made there because there's some very pertinent points. I want to put those points to Richard. Richard, do you think that there is a legitimate point to be made, Richard, about the concern on the part of the Leave side, at the very least, those who still want the UK to leave in the present situation, that the EU really did and does still have too much control over the UK, be it vis-a-vis the economy or laws, etc.?
I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about the idea of sovereignty. Basically, we have a situation of pooled sovereignty within the European Union. We share sovereignty to an extent where it might be an advantage to us. I think that Leavers have a point to the extent that sometimes it does seem a little perhaps as though France and Germany steer the ship and Britain doesn't. But by leaving the European Union, Britain has even less of a say in the way that the European Union goes. The deal that is proposed would give us less of a say rather than more. We would have no voting rights within Europe. So essentially, what we're talking about with the deal is exactly the situation that the Leave campaign said we were in, falsely, in that we had no control over the European Union. That would be the reality with the deal, although I do think the deal is much better than a no deal.
I'm wondering, Mr. Qazi, if you agree with Richard Branson, who is Virgin's CEO, the Virgin Group CEO, and he's basically warned from the point of view of a businessman that the UK, if it were to leave the European Union without a deal in place, would essentially be risking bankruptcy. And that would obviously have ramifications across the world, not just in Europe. Do you think that Europe is ready to play with that sort of fire?
Well, Europe was very unhappy with Britain deciding to leave the European Union, and they tried to negotiate a deal which would be fair to the European Union itself and its members who decided to stay, and at the same time be as acceptable as possible to the UK, even after its decision to leave. And squaring this particular circle has become a huge problem, and as yet the Prime Minister is far from being successful. And it looks that even if she is replaced by another Prime Minister of whichever party, if there's going to be an election in between or before an election or without an election, it appears that nobody can come up with a better solution than what she has on offer. A no deal is largely regarded as the worst possible outcome because it will have all kinds of horrendous consequences, and particularly amongst the business community. And I think Mr. Branson, who's a world figure, and I'm very privileged to be on the same program as him, would be the first to know that how bad it would be for business and the implications for the City of London as arguably the greatest financial center in the world, including New York. It would be very bad for them. And no Brexit would probably require, if I'm not mistaken, another referendum. And Prime Minister May has said, no, she has to respect the terms of the referendum, which was the greatest democratic exercise in Britain, which itself is the mother of most democracies, modern democracies. But it does look as if you had a second referendum, there would at least be a marginal reversal of the verdict, but the country might remain equally divided. And then there's the problem of Ireland and Northern Ireland and the so-called backstop in case there's no deal at all, so that the Good Friday agreements won't be undone altogether, which would be horrible. So it's so complicated. It looks right now that Prime Minister May has done her best, has not succeeded, may not, she's already said she won't fight the elections again, but she may have to leave office if she doesn't, the parliamentary vote goes against the offer. But it also looks like nobody can come up with a better deal from Europe, because Europe says we can't offer a better deal to a country that leaves than to a country that stays. Otherwise, the European Union would break up. So it's a devil of a problem.
Indeed, and Richard Connor, I'm wondering what you make of that, because in some ways, Richard.
But I mean, I'm very privileged to share. I'm sure he's an expert on the subject.
Yes, Richard Connor, I'm wondering what you make of this discussion about how the EU has acted throughout these negotiations. There were many people who said that, what are we expecting from the European Union? It'll obviously make life very hard for the UK to be leaving, because it wants to set that precedent that leaving the EU is no joke. But do you think in some ways, Richard, that the EU may end up hurting itself in the process vis-a-vis its own economy or otherwise?
Well, I think, the EU, it's not hurting it so much, it's hurting itself. The process will hurt the EU. But the process, and I'd say process, not a negotiation, because this was never really a negotiation. This was always a process. The EU had its own rules. Then Britain set its red lines about not being in the single market. So really, this deal, the terms of the deal was kind of inevitable, really, what Britain would get. And the EU is aware that this is not good for the EU. And obviously the British government is aware that it's not good economically. But we are where we are, basically.
Indeed. And do you think that in the case of a no deal, that the European Union is ready to accept the ramifications of that, Richard? Because again, as I quoted to the other guest, Branson warning that this would mean bankruptcy for the UK, that would have consequences for Europe as a whole, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the whole idea of a no-deal scenario would be disastrous, really. As I said earlier, I don't think, I have a feeling just from the numbers within Parliament that something would happen within British Parliament to ensure that did not happen. But I really am very wary of making predictions at this time.
Very well. So, Mr. Qazi, I'm wondering, how do you think the current U.S. administration's role in all of this has been? Because, Donald Trump has seemingly supported, at the very least, Brexit as a whole, the UK leaving the European Union, because then he gets to, negotiate a new trade deal, possibly with the UK individually. He's obviously placed tariffs already on Europe as a whole. Do you think that America has played a role here throughout this, what Richard called a process of these negotiations, and has that been a negative role in some ways, do you think?
Well, I mean, as usual, Trump has been sending mixed signals. He has favored Brexit at one time. He then has, earlier I think he said they would negotiate a bilateral, free trade agreement pretty quickly. I think now he's recently said something else, indicating that might not be as smooth a process as he indicated. So it wouldn't be wise to rely too much on his statements, because they do tend to change. What I do know is, from reading the press, is that while the vast majority believe the no-deal outcome would be the worst, for Britain. And of course it would not be good for Europe too. And Europe is quite clear about it, but maybe Britain would suffer even more. Nonetheless, Britain is the fifth largest economy in the world. It has a very, very advanced high-tech sector. Its military and its security apparatus is one of the most advanced. So cooperation with Britain has huge benefits for the U.S., for Europe, for all of that. That would stay in place. There were some economists who thought that Britain might sort of become more of a sort of safe haven for for global investment and all, so it would actually end up benefiting from leaving. Rather than being subject to Brussels rules, which are very complicated and at times apparently irrational, etc.
Right.
But that's a minority opinion. I don't know whether there's anything substantive in it. As of now, it seems that generally speaking, maybe there's a small majority thinking that there wasn't enough information available to the people who participated in the referendum, which went, which decided in favor of leaving.
Right.
And there are others who feel that, well, what's done is done. Now let's make the best of it and retain as good a relationship and also get the benefits of being more sovereign, and because England does have advantages of its own. There is, of course, the very complicated question of Ireland and all, you see. And that's a very difficult problem to resolve. And the last thing people want is to there to be uncertainty between the two parts of Ireland, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which could be very, very dangerous and all.
Indeed, Mr. Qazi, I will interrupt you there. I do apologize, but I want to thank you for ending it off there on the question of Ireland and Northern Ireland, because that's a very pertinent point to conclude this segment on. We, of course, appreciate all of our guests joining us. That was Mr. Ashraf Jahangir Qazi, former ambassador, who's speaking to us live from Islamabad. Earlier, we had another former ambassador speaking to us live from the Pakistani capital, Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi. We appreciate his insight, and of course, we appreciate Richard Connor, journalist of DW English, who was speaking to us live from Germany. Richard, we appreciate the insight and analysis that you provided for us here in The Scope on this very important topic. And of course, viewers, as all of our guests said, this is obviously a time of great uncertainty. And there is talk of course, the misinformation possibly that went into the entire Brexit referendum to begin with. But we are where we are at this point now. There is a Brexit deal on the table. It seems that the UK Parliament would reject that. Theresa May has not been able to get any concessions from the European Union on her trip to Brussels. So we'll have to wait and see how this works out in the coming days. Will Britain leave the EU with no deal in place? That's a huge question mark that remains looming at this point in time. That's all for this segment. Stay tuned though. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back, viewers. In this segment of Scope's second segment, we're going to discuss the arrest of a Huawei executive in Canada and the ramifications it's had, which have been beyond just the case of one telecommunications company. In the middle of a trade war between the U.S. and China and others, this is a move being seen as provocative by Chinese authorities. China has already ratcheted up the pressure. Now, the question is, how far is the West willing to go to limit Chinese influence? To discuss that further, we're firstly joined now by Ms. Gwen Robinson, who is the editor of Nikkei Asian Review. She's joining us live now from Australia. She's also a senior fellow at the Institute of Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. Gwen, as always, thank you for joining us here in The Scope. I wonder, Gwen, what you make of this entire case of not just the arrest of this Huawei executive, but, there have been accusations for a while now that Huawei is essentially an arm of China to spy on the West.
Right. I think, essentially, there's an element of that, but that's a vast oversimplification. And it's difficult to say, what do I make of the whole thing? There are so many dimensions to this, and they're huge. And I think it's being slightly simplified in media coverage as well as a US-China dispute and yet another manifestation of the escalating trade war. In fact, I think, what it was basically, it's the culmination of years of mounting concern, I think, primarily in America, but which has spread clearly to other countries as Huawei has extended its reach and network around the globe. So what we're seeing now, I think, is a reaction of years of, watching, monitoring, and, clearly a lot of paranoia on the US side as more and more evidence grew of how much Huawei has penetrated their tech networks with huge business to all the key US tech giants. And I was reading actually that a third of Huawei's key 90 plus suppliers are American companies. That works both ways. I mean, yes, it damages Huawei if it's forbidden to deal with US suppliers, but I think it's going to hit these companies very hard because, for example, I think for Qualcomm or one of those big US companies, Huawei accounts for something like 5% of their sales. That's a lot to knock out overnight. So I'm sure there's concern on that side. And meanwhile, you know, the global implications, it's spreading to Europe, and we've had news that New Zealand, Australia, lately Japan, some of the top tech companies in Japan are, you know, saying that they will cease to do business with Huawei. So I think it's just going upward from here.
Indeed, and you know, China is already flexing its muscles, isn't it, Gwen? Where we've had the arrest of you know, Michael Spavor, who's a Canadian national, and we've had the arrest of another Canadian too, rumored, Michael Kovrig as well. And obviously, as you said, that there are the economic implications, the business implications for both sides at this point in time. Talk of a boycott of Apple products in China as well. This will be catastrophic in some senses, won't it? And do you think that one side will eventually have to back down, and which side do you think that'll be?
Well, I think that's a question that is impossible to answer because it does imply that it's a very neat kind of winner takes all kind of situation. I don't think it is. I think there is actually inevitably going to have to be some compromise on each side. I think also this particular issue, separate from just the simple US-China trade dispute, is also requires a bit of understanding of how the whole future of 5G, this new 5G network, is rolling out now, and to understand the position of Huawei and how deeply it's entrenched in what is going to be, what we're all being told is the absolute sort of, you know, critical, whatever you call it, network technology of the future that is going to be nothing like we've ever seen on the internet beforehand. And Huawei has invested so much and has such a lead that I think the ferocity of the US reaction shows that they are extremely concerned also about how far America is behind Huawei on this new technology. And for example, Huawei has invested billions of dollars in building vast networks of base stations that are required for this new 5G technology, whereas the US has probably, I read estimates of 10% of what Huawei has in terms of these base stations, and that's just one aspect.
Indeed, and you know, where you are in Australia too, Gwen, there are concerns there as well about Huawei, and those have been long-standing concerns too. As I was reading today in the lead-up to this show, I wonder, the Chinese would say, or some Chinese, I should say, have been saying that this is all because Huawei is able to provide such products and services that even the American companies, as you alluded to in your answer there, are not able to. And obviously now we also have this comparison between Huawei products, and I'm talking about mobile phones, for example, just to pick up on something there, and comparing that to Apple phones. And Apple phones are significantly more expensive, Huawei phones are significantly cheaper. Essentially, this is almost looking like to Chinese that Americans are just trying to protect their businesses and their market. Do you think that's playing a part in all of this?
Well, again, you're asking some pretty good questions there, Waka, but I think, you know, there is an element of that. I think also there's a justifiable US view that, well, yes, you know, I mean, America has produced the great giants of the world in tech, Microsoft, Apple, etc., but America also has, and has proven, you know, very clearly proven, a very strict antitrust regime. It quite often takes action against companies that overstep the mark. The EU also does, and has, as we've seen, you know, very strong cases against Western companies on antitrust and other issues, market dominance. So, you know, yes, I think there is an element of that, but also I do think there's a political element. And sitting here in Australia and also based in Bangkok as I am, I can say every third person these days seems to have a Huawei phone. And the brilliance of Huawei has been to saturate the market with phones that are a reasonable quality, but which go from very cheap, very affordable, up to, you know, their Rolls-Royce phones. And somehow they haven't suffered the sort of cheap image that might accompany you if you are putting out very cheap phones. So there's been big uptake in Southeast Asia and I think beyond of these phones, which have very superior photography technology, which everyone loves a selfie these days. So I think in that respect, there's a lot of people sort of tied into the Huawei network who will be very upset if they can't get their new, you know, Huawei updated, upgraded phones. In Australia, I think it's touched a chord which is echoing in other parts of the world, I think, which is this fear of Chinese dominance, and that applies to all kinds of things. Australia has had a huge issue about, you know, the penetration of Chinese influence in academia and politics. So, you know, the Huawei case comes just as, you know, it really reinforces those kind of insecurities.
Indeed. So now talking about insecurities, in one of your earlier answers, you'd used the word paranoia, which I want to reuse again over here, Gwen, in my next question. And I wanted to ask about these concerns about Chinese spying, because there is a law in China where even private companies, if need be, would need to provide evidence or information and hand that over to the state. And, you know, many in the West, whatever country we may talk about, would use that as an excuse to say, listen, Huawei can't be trusted. It may very well be spying on us. Do you think that that is a legitimate concern?
Yeah, from everything I've read, and clearly, I mean, what is indisputable are sort of close links between not just Huawei, and this is a point I should have made earlier, but we're not just talking about Huawei. There's 4 other big Chinese tech telecoms companies, including ZTE and others who have been targeted, and I think ZTE are under similar kind of constraints or bans from US official contracts and also elsewhere. So we're talking about a bunch of companies, and yes, I think not just the links with the, or as you point out, their kind of readiness to help out the ruling party, the Communist Party, but also clearly links between Huawei, its founder, revered in China and highly suspected abroad, comes from the People's Liberation Army military establishment. There's loads of links, and also, of course, these 5 Chinese companies, some of them specialize very with a great lead in various security-related technology, surveillance and military systems. So, of course, there's a natural suspicion, and I think it hasn't helped that there's been quite a few reports of industrial espionage and cyber hacking. Some of these, I mean, a lot of these charges are not proven, because proving some of these things requires divulging a lot of sensitive information from the Western side as well. But there's clearly enough there to show that there has been justifiable concern that there are security considerations now. And as pointed out about Huawei's edge on the building of this new 5G technology and architecture, it's already sold its services to many countries around the world. So I think that's what we're seeing now, is huge US pressure on these countries to back away. But secondly, these countries themselves, Australia, New Zealand, now Japan, are probably realizing that these concerns are more legitimate than maybe they thought about before they gave contracts, and Huawei's in there building things. If they have to cancel, renege, whatever, I think that'll be the next phase. There'll be some bitter disputes about that. I was just reading some quotes from a European official complaining that if it's going the way everyone thinks it is against Huawei, and pressure not just from the US but also from other quarters to extract countries, governments or companies from contracts with Huawei, it could set back Europe and possibly the US's embrace of 5G technology by a year at least. So that's really a consideration, I think.
Okay, so then let's talk about, and I know I asked you about this a bit earlier, but I wanted to look at this as a macro issue as well, once again, about China flexing its muscles, because China is certainly no pushover when it responds to such matters, especially when it comes to its economy, its own companies. You know, there's the case of Norway, which I was just reading about, and it was fascinating that in 2010, China decided to drastically cut back on its imports of just salmon from Norway after the Norwegian Nobel Committee handed a peace prize to a human rights activist who was Chinese. Norwegian producers had to then wait 7 years to be able to re-enter the Chinese market, obviously over those years losing a huge share of the Chinese market to begin with. That's just an example, of course. We would have tourism, Chinese tourism. For Canada, for example, the country which seems to have the target spot on itself right now over the case of this Huawei executive's arrest. Do you think that the Western countries who are concerned over China and China will come to some sort of an understanding where both sides won't hurt each other too much, if I may, term it that way?
Well, yeah, you raised some good points. I would say overall, yes. I mean, because it cuts both ways. Again, any trade dispute is going to probably hurt both sides, as you suggest. So there's got to be some kind of accommodation. And even though the Communist Party has this reputation for being, all pervasive control, I think the tidal wave of Chinese tourists that have been unleashed on Western countries and destinations, I can hardly see it being turned off just like that, like a tap. So that's kind of on the softer sides. I think on other sides, yes, there'll be an accommodation, because even in the Norway case, I mean, you've got it again two ways. China cuts off imports from one country. It can work the other way. It depends which country that is. In the case of the US-China relationship, I think this trade war is hurting both sides substantially. So I can see, eventually, if this is going to get out of hand, that there has to be some kind of accommodation. But I think there's going to be a long way to go before that, and the involvement now putting very sensitive technology and telecoms at the heart of this new dimension of the friction puts it on another plane. It's not just about tourism and widgets or salmon imports or something. So I'd say that there's going to be it would have to probably include and involve perhaps Congress. There's a lot of angry rhetoric coming out of US Congress. On the Chinese side, there'll be, I'm sure there's a lot of discussion. But let's just take a reality check and say right now, this whole Huawei thing is blown up at a very, very critical time of the US-China trade dispute. We were just seeing some signs of that both sides did want to pedal back, and as you are probably aware, Donald Trump even actually stated that he doesn't mind reaching some kind of accommodation on Meng, the arrested Huawei CFO and daughter of the founder, in order to clinch a bigger deal, which is to, achieve some kind of resolution of the trade dispute. So I think that may inform both sides. And right now it looks like panic stations, but and it doesn't look good for Huawei, I must say. But, one might say that it doesn't have much of a leg to stand on. But in fact, given how far it's penetrated into, the setting up of new networks right around the world, I'd say that there is some maneuver room for Huawei.
Okay, let me add another voice to this conversation, if I may, Gwen. We're now joined by Mr. Einar Tangen, who is a political and economic affairs commentator, and he is joining us live now from Beijing. Einar, thank you for taking your time out to speak to us here in The Scope. Once again, we appreciate your time. Einar, I'm wondering what you make of this entire issue, starting off from Huawei, the arrest of that executive in Canada, to the ramifications that we've seen ever since, and the role that all of this may play in this overarching trade war, as we term it.
Yes, you have to keep in mind what the events surround. This was a period between 2009 and 2014 that was not followed up. It was originally started under Obama, and then the treaty was consummated. Nothing went forward. So the timing of this is very suspicious. Also suspicious is the fact that they actually sought an arrest warrant. There are many instances where there have been violations of sanctions, whether it applies in drugs, money laundering, etc., and they did not actually intercept anybody. There are major banks in America and also in Europe, and no one was arrested. So it's increasingly looks like, and probably will be played by Huawei, that this is entirely political, that the U.S. government is trying to use this as a lever in its ongoing tariff dispute. There is a clause in the extradition treaty between the U.S. and Canada. It's under Article 4, Section 1, subparagraph 3, that indicates any kind of action that is deemed political in nature can be the grounds for a refusal to honor the extradition request.
So Einar, I'm wondering, right now Huawei, as you well know, is under a lot of pressure, and China's under a lot of pressure, I should say, overall. As Gwen earlier pointed out, our other guest, that it's not just Huawei we're talking about, but there are a number of Chinese tech companies that are under pressure. But if I may use Huawei as an example for a moment, we have Australia, New Zealand, and recently a UK company as well saying that it would not be using Huawei equipment for the 5G mobile network. And again, that's just an example of what I'm using at this point in time to discuss the effect that this would have on China itself. Now, Einar, the concerns that the West has raised about possible Chinese spying. Do you think that that is all just a tactic within this trade war, or are those concerns over privacy and spying and otherwise legitimate?
Well, there are always concerns about privacy and security, and they can be legitimate. In this particular case, though, Huawei has offered to share all of the code. In that particular case, they would have the ability to look over and find any kind of spyware or malware, or backdoors, etc. Now, remember, it's a little bit hypocritical in the sense the CIA was caught designing, putting malware into hard drives a few years ago, so that they would have a backdoor, basically, in essence, to every laptop and desktop computer, anything that would use those. It's been speculated many times that certain software companies, very large, American, have given over the backdoor keys to the U.S. government in the name of security. In some cases, there were antitrust actions, and it is believed that they were settled in part by giving these kind of backdoor access out there. Governments will continue to use these things. We've seen this in the Snowden revelations, in the Panama, not the Panama ones, the Julian Assange, and also the ones from Australia. It's quite clear that that the battle here is about perception. There is a trade war going on. There's this concern about the China leapfrogging both Europe and the U.S. and other developed countries in this race to create 5G. Why is 5G important? It's part of the artificial intelligence threesome. The first one is data collection. Second one is communication. Yeah. And the third one is crunching. That's the AI. So this is really, it looks to be the real concern here is to hobble their competitor as they race for the finish line.
All right, Einar, I just wanted to get your final word from you before we conclude this segment. I wanted to ask, do you think that the West and China will be able to work through this right now? Because this will hurt both sides, won't it, if this becomes worse?
Yes, it will, but unfortunately, it's a long-term situation. You'll recall last year there was 100 days to figure this out. This year it's 90 days. It doesn't really matter how many days there are. There can be concessions made in terms of more trade, but China is not going to fundamentally change its economy away from a centrally planned economy, and that really seems to be the issue for a lot of people, especially surrounding Donald Trump and in Donald Trump's perception, although it's not quite clear that what his understanding of China is.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. We appreciate both of our guests and their insights as they provided them. We were joined there by Einar Tangen, political and economic affairs commentator, speaking to us live from Beijing. And we were also joined by Ms. Gwen Robinson, who is the editor of Nikkei Asian Review, and she was speaking to us live from Australia. We appreciate both of their insights and their analysis as provided on this very important story, viewers. Not just the arrest of the Huawei executive, that's not the only important factor here, though there's a lot to talk about there as well. But the ramifications this had, the lead up, the backstory to it, and what may now happen going forward. What will China do further to hold the West to account over what it sees as an incorrect move vis-a-vis a tech company that is Chinese and other companies that are Chinese as well? How will this hurt the West itself? How will this hurt the Chinese economy? A lot of aspects that still need to be seen, how all of that will shape up in the coming days. We'll leave that for now for this edition of The Scope. We appreciate you watching. This has been Waqar Rizvi.